It had been a long time since I'd needed a break, but when the opportunity presented itself, I jumped at it. The plan was simple enough. Head to my late uncle's cabin in the woods, a place I'd only ever heard stories about, but never visited. It sat on a small stretch of land that bordered a dense, untouched forest. The weather was supposed to be clear for the weekend, so the thought of a peaceful, quiet retreat seemed like the perfect escape. Little did I know my decision would bring me face to face with more than just solitude. I arrived at the cabin late on a Thursday afternoon, the gravel driveway crunching under my tires as I pulled up. The cabin looked just like it had been described to me, small, weathered, and secluded. It was built with old timber, its shingles moss-covered and darkened by the years. There was no electricity here, and the only light came from the flickering flame of a wood stove inside. I'd heard my uncle used to come here to escape from everything. His stressful job, the constant noise of the city, and perhaps the burdens of his own thoughts. It seemed peaceful enough. I didn't mind the lack of modern amenities. The phone had no signal and there was no Wi-Fi, but I wasn't interested in distractions. I wanted nothing more than to sit by the fire, read, and relax. I unloaded my bags, set up the essentials for a few days in the wilderness, and took a moment to absorb the stillness of the place. The air was cool, and the scent of pine trees hung heavy in the atmosphere, mixed with the dampness of the earth. The only sounds were the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional bird call far in the distance. It felt isolated, which was exactly what I needed. By the time evening rolled around, the rain had started. At first, it was just a light drizzle, but as night fell, it grew heavier. I built a fire inside and watched the flames dance in the stone hearth. The cabin creaked and groaned with the wind, but it wasn't unsettling. It was just the wood shifting, the house settling in for the storm. As the rain tapped against the cabin windows, I settled into my chair with a book. But there was something oddly unsettling about the stillness outside. It wasn't the usual silence that accompanied a storm. It felt as if the woods themselves were watching, listening. I brushed the thought away. It was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. The first night passed without incident, but by the second day, things began to feel off. The rain had only gotten worse. The forecast I had checked before coming had promised scattered showers, but what I faced now was a relentless downpour. It didn't let up for hours. The rain pounded the roof and windows, and the low rumble of thunder echoed across the hills. I had gone for a walk earlier that morning, hoping to stretch my legs, but the forest was a maze of thick, dripping trees. The trail, though familiar from old maps, had become muddy and slick, and the wind howled through the branches as if urging me to turn back. I felt a sense of unease in the air, something that had started gnawing at the back of my mind. Maybe it was the storm, maybe it was just being alone out here, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. I had tried to dismiss it as paranoia. After all, what could possibly happen out here in the middle of nowhere? But the thought lingered. I decided to spend most of the day inside, reading and trying to distract myself from the growing tension. The cabin, for all its charm, had a peculiar aura, an unsettling quiet that seemed to amplify with the storm. The longer I stayed in the place, the more I noticed small things that I hadn't before. The way the floorboards creaked when no one was around. The strange noise that echoed from the walls, as though something were moving in the shadows. As the hours passed, I sat by the fire, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling crawling up my spine. It was early evening when I first heard it. A knock at the door. At first, I thought it was the wind, the rain beating against the cabin in such a way that it sounded like a knock. But no, it was too rhythmic, too deliberate. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest. It was strange. Who would be out here, in the middle of a storm at this time of night? No one knew I was here, and my phone had no service, so there was no way for anyone to reach me. I slowly stood up, my legs stiff from sitting too long, and walked cautiously toward the door. My hand hovered over the old brass handle. I knew I should have felt nervous, but a strange curiosity urged me to open it. I cracked the door open, just enough to peer out. The rain lashed against my face as I squinted into the darkness. There was no one in sight. The The porch was empty. The trees swayed violently in the wind, their branches creaking and groaning. I stepped outside, the wet earth squelching beneath my boots, and looked around. Nothing. The storm had picked up, and the sound of rain and wind drowned out any other noises. I stood there for a moment, confused, before I closed the door and locked it. I didn't think too much of it at first. The storm played tricks on the mind, after all. But as I turned to head back to the fire, I noticed something strange. A fresh set of muddy footprints leading up to the door. They were large, way too large to be my own. The print was deep, as if someone had been standing there for a while. But there was no one around. I stared at the tracks for a long time, unsure of what to do. My mind raced. There had been no sign of anyone when I had stepped outside. No vehicles, no noise. I grabbed a flashlight and moved cautiously around the cabin's perimeter. The footprints continued along the side, leading into the woods. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as I followed them. But after a few yards, they stopped. It was as if whoever had been there had vanished into thin air. I spent the rest of the night in a state of heightened awareness. Every creak, every gust of wind seemed to make the walls groan, like someone or something was moving around just outside my reach. I tried to sleep, but I couldn't relax. The unease had settled deep into my bones, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. By morning, the rain had finally started to let up, though the sky remained heavy with dark clouds. I made coffee, trying to steady my nerves, and sat by the window, gazing out at the forest. The world seemed so quiet now, as though the storm had washed everything clean. But the calmness felt unsettling, like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I decided I couldn't stay cooped up inside any longer. I had to do something, even if that meant going back out into the woods. The rain had stopped, and the trail was still muddy, but it wasn't as treacherous as before. I grabbed my jacket and set off into the woods, hoping the walk would clear my head. As I ventured deeper into the forest, the atmosphere felt different. Heavier, more oppressive. The trees seemed to close in around me, their trunks dark and twisted. The path wound around thick underbrush, and the only sounds were the soft squelch of my boots in the mud and the occasional rustle of leaves as the wind picked up. I didn't know what I expected to find out here, but the further I walked, the more I felt like I was being drawn in. There was something about this place, a strange, magnetic pull that made me want to venture deeper, to uncover whatever it was that had been nagging at my mind since I arrived. Then I saw it, a shape, half hidden by the trees, just off the path. At first, I thought it was just another tree, another odd formation in the underbrush. But as I stepped closer, I realized it wasn't a tree at all. It was something else, something out of place. A tarp stretched over what appeared to be some sort of structure. It was crude, hastily constructed, and hidden just enough to blend into the woods. I approached cautiously, my heart racing. Something felt wrong about it, like it didn't belong. It was too close to the cabin, too close to where I had parked my car. Whoever had been out here, they were nearby. I crouched beside it, careful not to disturb the tarp. Slowly, I lifted one edge. Underneath, there was a pile of branches, a makeshift shelter, and a body. The body was slumped, its limbs twisted in an unnatural way. It was hard to make out the details in the dim light, but the sight made my stomach lurch. I recoiled, taking a step back. Whoever it was, they were clearly dead. There was no sign of life. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to run, to flee back to the cabin and lock myself inside. But another part of me, curiosity, fear, or something else, urged me to stay, to investigate. I turned and ran back to the cabin, my mind spinning. It felt as though the ground was shifting under me, and every footstep took me further away from the safety I thought I had. I slammed the door shut behind me, heart pounding in my chest. The fire in the hearth flickered weakly in the cold, and the wind outside howled as though it too were warning me. I never found out what happened to the person in the woods. There were no more knocks at the door, no more strange footprints, nothing to explain the presence of the body. But the storm eventually passed, the rain ceased, and the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in days. The cabin sat on the edge of the woods like it had been forgotten. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, a place for me to clear my head after a rough year. At least that's what I thought when I booked the place. A small, secluded spot in the forest just outside of Asheville, North Carolina. The ad said it was cozy, a perfect retreat from the hustle of city life. And honestly, I needed the break. When I arrived, the sun was just starting to dip below the horizon. The air was thick with humidity, a typical August evening in the mountains. I could already hear the chirping of crickets, the occasional rustle of animals in the underbrush, and the wind whispering through the trees. It felt like a peaceful place until I noticed the cabin itself. It wasn't that it was run down, it just looked wrong. The wooden beams were weathered, a dull gray rather than the rich, warm brown I expected. The small porch had a pair of old rocking chairs, but the paint was chipped and peeling. The windows were dirty, covered in layers of dust that made it hard to see inside. Still, I shrugged it off. It wasn't a luxury rental. I wasn't expecting a 5-star hotel. I parked my car, grabbed my bag, and made my way up to the door. The lock was stiff, and it took a little more effort than usual to turn the key. When I finally stepped inside, the smell hit me. Musty, like something had been sitting and used for far too long. The interior was dark, the only light coming from the fading glow outside. I flipped the switch for the overhead light, and the room came to life, though the yellowish glow only made everything look older and more worn. There was a fireplace along the far wall, though it didn't look like it had been used in ages. A couple of mismatched chairs sat around a small, round table. The kitchen area was tucked into the corner, with a few shelves lined with cans of soup and pasta, most of which were clearly expired. A small hallway led to a bedroom at the back of the cabin. I set my bag down and wandered around the room for a moment, trying to get a sense of the place. It was quiet, almost unnervingly so. No sounds from outside now, just silence. The sun had set completely by the time I finished unpacking. I was tired but decided to go outside for a walk. The air was cooler now, and the crickets had become louder, their constant hum filling the quiet night. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out onto the porch. The night was thick with trees, nothing but dark, twisted shapes around me. The forest stretched on forever. As I walked, I kept my flashlight trained on the ground in front of me, careful of the roots and rocks that littered the path. The woods felt alive, but not in a comforting way. Every rustle of the leaves, every snap of a twig, felt deliberate, like someone or something was watching me. I shook it off as paranoia. I was just in a new place, and the sounds of nature were unfamiliar. I came to a small clearing, a spot where the trees had been cut down some time ago. There was a large rock in the center, half covered in moss. I sat down on it, trying to calm my nerves. The night was too still, and my thoughts began to race. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the cabin, about the entire place. I turned back to the cabin, noticing how dark it had gotten. The only light now came from a faint glow through the dirty windows. Something about it made me uneasy. As I stood up to leave, I heard it. A low creak from somewhere behind me, followed by the unmistakable crunch of footsteps on dry leaves. My heart leaped into my throat. I spun around, shining my flashlight in every direction, but the woods were empty. No sign of anyone. I took a deep breath and shook my head, trying to calm down. It was probably just a deer or some other animal. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I made my way back to the cabin quickly, more out of instinct than anything else. Once inside, I locked the door behind me and pulled the curtains shut. I didn't need to be paranoid, but something about the woods outside felt wrong. I didn't sleep well that night. It wasn't the discomfort of the bed. It was the silence, the kind of silence that presses on you from all sides, making your mind fill in the gaps. Every creak of the house, every groan of the foundation, made me tense up, wondering if I was alone. I convinced myself I was just being silly. Around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by the sound of something heavy hitting the floor. My heart raced. I lay there in the darkness, listening intently. The house was silent again, but the air felt thick, like something had changed. Something had shifted. Slowly, I swung my legs off the bed and stood up, my bare feet brushing the cold wooden floor. My flashlight was on the nightstand next to the bed, and I reached for it without making a sound. I didn't want to wake up anything that might be lurking in the dark. The flashlight flickered when I turned it on, but it finally lit up, casting a thin beam of light across the room. I scanned the space. Everything seemed normal. I crept out of the bedroom, heart pounding in my chest. The rest of the cabin was dark, but the moonlight coming through the dirty windows gave it an eerie glow. I slowly made my way to the living room, and that's when I saw it. A door on the far side of the room, one I hadn't noticed before, was slightly ajar. I was sure it had been closed when I arrived. I didn't remember seeing it open, and yet now, there it was, just a crack wide enough for me to see the faint outline of something in the darkness behind it. I hesitated. A part of me wanted to leave, to run out the door and never look back. But another part, the part that wanted answers, urged me forward. I took a step toward the door, every muscle in my body tensed. As I pushed the door open with one hand, the flashlight in the other, I was hit with the overwhelming smell of decay. It was faint but unmistakable. The beam of light landed on something that made my stomach twist. There, on the floor, was a body. It wasn't like I had imagined. It wasn't neatly positioned or carefully hidden. It was sprawled out awkwardly, the limbs twisted at odd angles. The skin was pale, waxy, and almost unnaturally smooth. The smell of rot was thick in the air now, making me gag as I stood frozen in place. My eyes locked on the body. It was a man older than me, dressed in jeans and a faded t-shirt. His face was bruised, swollen, his eyes wide open but glazed over. He had clearly been dead for some time. I felt my knees give way beneath me. I collapsed onto the floor, my hands shaking as I pressed them against my face to keep from vomiting. What the hell was going on? How had this man ended up in the cabin? Was he the previous tenant? Was this why the place felt so off? I didn't want to stay here another second. I needed to leave. But then I saw it, the blood-stained knife, half hidden behind a nearby chair. My stomach churned as I realized that someone had been here recently, and they had left in a hurry. My mind raced as I stumbled to my feet. I had to get out of there, I had to. The door slammed behind me. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. There, standing in the doorway, was another figure. I didn't wait to see who it was. I bolted for the front door, throwing it open and running into the night, not caring where I went. The sounds of footsteps behind me kept pace, but I didn't dare turn around. I didn't stop running until I reached the main road. My car was parked on the shoulder, just a little ways down. I didn't care if I was going to get into trouble for leaving. I didn't care about anything but getting away from that cabin. By the time I reached my car, my breath was ragged, and the terror that had gripped me still hadn't let go. I fumbled with the keys, my hands too shaky to get the lock undone. Finally, I got in, slammed the door behind me, and started the engine. The tires spun as I tore down the road, not looking back. I never went back to that cabin. When I called the authorities to report what I'd found, they told me they'd check it out. They didn't seem too concerned, but they promised to investigate. Later, I found out that the man in the cabin had been reported missing months earlier. No one knew how he had gotten there or who had left him behind, and the authorities had no answers. To this day, I don't know what happened that night, but I'll never forget the image of that body, the smell of decay, and the feeling of being watched. It's been years, and I still can't shake the memory. But I can't go back, not even if I wanted to. My name is Brian Hartley. I was 41 when it happened, back in 2016. I lived in Newcastle at the time, working as a mechanic, trying to put things back together after a long divorce. My wife and I had separated the year before, and I was just starting to get used to living on my own again. My daughter was with her mom, and I had no one to answer to, which felt both freeing and hollow. So I started doing something I used to love, spending time in the woods. I found this old cabin online. Not one of those rental things with hot tubs and fresh linen, but a real old hunting cabin way out near Kielder Forest. It wasn't even properly listed on any site. A mate from work, Rob, said his uncle owned it but barely used it anymore. He gave me a number scribbled on an old betting slip. A week later, I'd paid 100 quid cash for 3 nights, no paperwork, no questions. I loaded up my truck with tools, firewood, tinned food, a battery radio, a sleeping bag, and a small bottle of whiskey. It was October, cold enough to be uncomfortable, but not frozen. Perfect for getting lost and clearing my head. The drive up was longer than I expected. The last half hour was nothing but dirt tracks, deer signs, and fog. I passed 2 other cabins along the way, both of them dark. One of them looked completely abandoned. When I got to mine, the place was just how Rob described it. 1 floor, for small rooms, metal roof, no power. The door was stiff, and the inside smelled like damp wood and mice, but it had what I needed. A wood burner, a few old chairs, a cot, and thick walls. I dropped my bag, lit the stove, cracked the bottle, and by sundown, I was sitting out front watching the forest fall asleep. That first night was calm. I chopped some wood, ate cold stew straight from the tin, and fell asleep early. The forest at night was louder than I remembered. Wind pushed through the trees like water rushing over rocks. I heard something bump the side of the cabin once, but I figured it was a deer, maybe a boar. I'd seen some tracks on the way in. I didn't think much of it. The next day I walked for hours. I took my folding map and tried to follow a loop trail that passed near an old quarry. It was wet and overgrown, and I lost the trail half an hour in. My boots were soaked through. By the time I made it back to the cabin, my legs were shaking and my socks were steaming. I dried everything by the fire, boiled some rice and beans, then sat on the front step as the sun went down again. That's when I saw someone. I was staring through the trees, just letting my eyes drift like you do when you're tired, and I caught movement. Maybe 50 meters back, too far to see clearly, but something upright. Human height. Could have been a tree swaying or a tall shadow. But then it moved again, sharper this time. 2 steps to the left, then nothing. I stood up slowly, watched for another minute. Nothing. I told myself it was a hunter, a hiker, someone just passing through. I walked back inside, bolted the door, and tried to ignore the thud in my chest. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the figure. Why were they that deep in the woods? Why didn't they have a light? No gear? I didn't hear a vehicle. I didn't hear any branches break. No talking. Nothing. At around 2 a.m., I got up to take a piss. There was a small bucket in the corner of the cabin I'd been using, but this time I went outside. The air was freezing. My breath came out in clouds. The trees were black against a darker sky. I stood there listening. That kind of silence that's not really silent at all. Wind through dry leaves, some owl in the distance, the stove popping faintly inside. Then I heard something. Fast, dry footsteps through leaves. Then stopping. I turned sharply. Couldn't see a thing. The woods just swallowed everything. I waited a full minute, trousers halfway up, heart pounding. Nothing moved. When I got back inside, I locked the door again and pushed the heavy chair up against it. I felt stupid, but it helped me sleep. The next morning was foggy again. I made coffee with boiled rainwater and powdered mix, then went out to check the area. Nothing obvious. No footprints, but the ground was mostly moss and wet leaf cover. Still, I started carrying my small axe with me everywhere after that. Not because I expected to use it, just because it made me feel like I had some control. Around noon, I hiked a few kilometers west, trying to find the quarry again. I took my time, followed a stream for a bit, and eventually ended up on an old dirt road. It wasn't marked on my map, just a single muddy track that curved away into the trees. I followed it for maybe 15 minutes until I saw something strange. There was a tree on the right side of the track. Big, twisted thing. Oak, I think. And carved into the bark at eye level were 2 letters, BR. They looked fresh, maybe a few days old. Sharp lines, no moss in the cuts yet. Same initials as mine. I touched them, then pulled my hand back like it was hot. I looked around slowly. Nothing moved, but my scalp prickled, the way it does when someone stands too close behind you. I turned back, walked faster than I meant to. When I got back to the cabin, the air felt off. Not colder, just heavier. I don't know how else to explain it. Like someone had just been there. I walked around the building twice, axe in hand. Nothing. Inside, I checked my stuff. It was all where I left it. But something on the floor caught my eye. A line of dirt. Just a streak, like someone had stepped in with a muddy boot and then brushed it clean again. The door had been locked. I was sure of it. But the window latch on the back, small, wooden, and old, was slightly loose. It might have been open before. I didn't remember. That night, I didn't drink. I kept the fire low and turned the battery radio to static so I could hear better. I laid in the cot with the axe beside me, fully dressed. It was just past midnight when I heard it, crunching outside. Slow, deliberate steps. Not an animal. Too rhythmic. Too heavy. I sat up and killed the radio. The cabin was silent. More steps. Closer. Then the soft creak of the front step. Just one. Then stillness. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. Then something tapped the window. Once. Like a fingernail. Then again. Then silence. I don't know how long I sat there. Maybe 5 minutes. Maybe 50. Eventually, I heard the steps again, but moving away. Into the woods. Then nothing. First light, I packed. I shoved everything into the truck without folding or organizing. I didn't even eat. I just wanted out. But when I turned the key, the truck clicked and died. Battery flat. I popped the hood. Wires were cut. Clean. Deliberate. I felt my stomach drop. That kind of fear that makes you dizzy. I looked around. Axe in one hand, wrench in the other. No movement. I waited inside the cabin all day, just pacing, thinking, planning. I had enough food and water, but I didn't want to spend another night. I needed to walk out. The closest farm or road was maybe 8 kilometers back. If I left now, I could make it before dark. But I didn't leave, because around 2 p.m. I saw him, the same shape from before, this time closer, standing halfway between the cabin and the tree line. Just still. I squinted. He was wearing something dark. Jacket or coat. Couldn't see his face. He didn't wave. Didn't move. Just stood. I stepped back inside, heart hammering. Then I made a mistake. I yelled. I told him I was armed. I didn't use names, didn't ask questions. Just shouted once, loud and sharp. Then silence. I watched through the crack in the boards. 10 minutes passed. He was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I sat up with the axe in one hand, a knife in the other, barely blinking. At some point near dawn, I heard scratching. Not tapping, scratching. At the back window. I didn't move. Then I heard footsteps, but not outside. Inside. In the other room. I stood slowly, raised the axe. The door to the other room creaked, and then I realized the sound wasn't coming from inside. It was echo. The scratching was louder now. It was both windows, both sides, 2 people. I backed into the corner and waited. Then, nothing. Cold silence. I must have passed out. When I opened my eyes again, it was bright. Morning. Real morning. Blue sky. I grabbed my bag, my axe, everything I could carry. I didn't care about the truck anymore. I walked south toward where I came from, fast. Every sound felt too sharp. I didn't stop to rest. I didn't drink water. I just kept walking until I hit the old access road. 2 hours later, I found a ranger's hut. Knocked until someone answered. Told them my truck broke down and that I thought I saw someone messing around the cabin. I didn't go into detail. Didn't want them thinking I was crazy. A few days later, I came back with It had been a long week, and the idea of escaping to a small cabin in the woods felt like the perfect way to unwind. My husband, Lucas, had found this place through a friend of a friend. It was secluded, tucked away far from any city or town, making it the ideal spot for us to disconnect and enjoy a quiet weekend together. I needed this. We both did. We left our house early in the morning on Friday, the sun still low in the sky. The drive was peaceful, with little traffic, just the hum of the engine and the occasional chirp of birds. Lucas had been excited about the cabin, talking about how relaxing it would be to cook on a wood stove and spend time in nature. I wasn't exactly a nature person, but the thought of being away from our busy lives, away from the constant notifications and calls, seemed perfect. The cabin itself was small, a single-story structure with a stone chimney, a small porch, and large windows that looked out onto the dense woods. The exterior was weathered, the wood darkened by years of exposure to the elements. It wasn't the kind of place you'd expect to find modern amenities, but it had everything we needed: running water, a wood stove, and a few comfortable chairs. We unloaded our bags, set up a few things, and started to settle in. Felt strange at first, the silence. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves in the wind and the occasional snap of twigs underfoot. The cabin had no Wi-Fi, no cell service, nothing to remind us of the world we'd left behind. At first, I felt uneasy, but Lucas seemed perfectly at ease. He made tea, and we sat on the porch, watching the trees sway and listening to the sounds of the forest. I had to admit, the place had a certain charm. As evening approached, we started a fire inside the cabin. The warmth from the fire was a welcome relief from the crisp air outside. Lucas opened a bottle of wine, and we ate dinner, talking about everything and nothing. The evening passed slowly, and by the time the fire had burned down to embers, we were both feeling the effects of the wine and the long drive. Lucas suggested we head to bed, and we made our way to the small bedroom, the flickering firelight casting long shadows on the walls. That night, I slept deeply, the quiet of the cabin wrapping around me like a blanket. But it wasn't the peaceful sleep I had hoped for. At some point in the middle of the night, I woke up. It wasn't a loud noise or anything specific that had disturbed me, but something felt off. I lay still, listening. The sound of wind outside had died down, and all I could hear was the occasional creak of the cabin settling. I looked over at Lucas, who was still fast asleep beside me. His steady breathing was comforting, but something in the air felt thick, almost suffocating. I dismissed the feeling and closed my eyes, trying to drift back to sleep. It wasn't until the following morning that the unease started to settle in. I woke up early, as I often did, and found myself staring out the window at the forest beyond. The sun had just risen, casting a soft, golden light over the trees. But there was something about the scene that felt wrong. The trees, tall and silent, seemed almost too still. I tried to shake the feeling, thinking it was just my imagination running wild, but the sensation lingered. I decided to take a walk to clear my head. The morning was cool, and the air smelled fresh and clean, typical of a forest. I walked a little ways down a narrow trail behind the cabin, the ground soft under my feet. The forest was dense, with towering pines and thick underbrush, but the path was clear, winding its way deeper into the woods. I wasn't gone long before I started to feel that same sense of unease. It wasn't the isolation that bothered me, it was something else. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me, but there was nothing, just the woods, endless and still. I headed back to the cabin, and Lucas was up by the time I returned. He seemed in good spirits, as usual, making coffee and getting breakfast ready. I mentioned the strange feeling I had earlier, but he just laughed it off, saying it was probably just the quiet of the forest getting to me. I agreed with him, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The day passed uneventfully. We spent some time hiking around the cabin, exploring the area, and collecting firewood. By the time evening rolled around, I was exhausted. But when night came, the sense of unease returned, stronger than before. That night, as we sat by the fire, I couldn't stop glancing at the forest just beyond the cabin. The shadows in the trees seemed to move, even though there was no wind. I tried to tell myself it was just the flickering light of the fire playing tricks on my eyes, but the longer I stared, the more I felt like something was watching us. I mentioned it to Lucas, but he didn't seem concerned. He suggested we go to bed early, and I agreed, though I wasn't sure if I was ready to face the silence of the night again. We climbed into bed, and for a while, I just stared at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the cabin settling. But after a while, I drifted off. The next morning, I woke up early again. This time, however, the unease was more than just a feeling. There was something else, something that had changed overnight. I sat up in bed, staring at the small window beside the bed. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, but there was a pale light in the sky. I glanced over at Lucas, still fast asleep, and tried to shake the feeling. But when I looked back out the window, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, standing just outside the cabin, was a man. He was barely visible in the early morning light, but there was no mistaking it. A figure, tall and thin, standing motionless in the trees, staring directly at the cabin. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced, trying to process what I was seeing. The man wasn't moving, just standing there, like he had been there for hours. I didn't want to wake Lucas. I didn't want to seem crazy, but I couldn't take my eyes off the figure. He didn't seem to notice me staring. I was too afraid to make a sound, too afraid to move. My body felt frozen, my muscles tense. The figure remained there for what felt like an eternity, and just when I thought I couldn't stand it any longer, he slowly turned and disappeared into the trees. I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. I didn't know what to think. I wasn't sure if I had imagined it, if it had been a trick of the light or some kind of strange, twisted dream. But as the sun rose higher and I tried to push the image from my mind, I couldn't help but feel like the woods around us were no longer as safe as they had seemed before. Lucas woke up a little later, and I didn't tell him about what I saw. I didn't want to worry him. Instead, I kept busy, preparing breakfast and acting as normal as I could. But every now and then, my eyes would drift to the window, half expecting to see that same figure again. The day passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That night, as we sat by the fire again, I kept watching the trees. The shadows seemed darker than before, the silence more oppressive. I was almost relieved when we decided to go to bed early again, hoping that sleep would take away the growing sense of dread. But it didn't. Couldn't sleep. Every little creak of the cabin, every rustle in the trees, made my heart race. I lay awake for hours, staring into the darkness, trying to convince myself that everything was fine, that there was nothing to be afraid of. But the fear wouldn't go away. At some point in the night, I heard something, a faint tapping on the window, just beyond the edge of the cabin. I held my breath, waiting, but nothing came after that. The noise stopped. I lay there in the dark, too afraid to move, too afraid to even breathe. It felt like the longest night of my life. The next morning, we packed up and left the cabin early. Neither of us said a word during the drive back, but I could tell Lucas was just as relieved as I was to leave. We never spoke of the figure in the woods, and I never told him about the tapping on the window. But that feeling, the one that something was watching us, never truly left. I don't know what happened that weekend, or what that man was doing out there. But I know one thing, I'll never go back to that cabin. I don't know what was out there in those woods, but I'm certain I don't want to find out. It was late autumn, and the cabin I had rented was nestled deep in the forest of the French countryside, far from any towns or other homes. The air was thick with the smell of pine, damp earth, and wood smoke, the kind of scent that fills your lungs and makes you feel both grounded and alone at the same time. I'd come to this remote cabin to get away from everything: work, city noise, people. A much-needed escape. The cabin was small but sturdy, a two-story structure with a rough-hewn wooden exterior. Inside, it was rustic but well-maintained, with thick wooden beams supporting the ceiling and a stone fireplace that took up most of one wall. I had no particular plans for my stay other than to enjoy the solitude, maybe read a few books, take long walks through the forest, and forget about everything that had been weighing on my mind. At first, the silence was comforting. No cars, no phones ringing, no hum of city life. Just the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind and the sound of birds in the distance. It was peaceful in a way I hadn't experienced in years. I arrived just as dusk was settling in, the sun disappearing behind the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I unpacked my bags, started a fire in the hearth, and made myself a simple meal of pasta and wine. The warmth from the fire and the flickering light on the walls made the cabin feel cozy, almost welcoming. But as the night wore on, a subtle unease began to settle in. It was hard to explain, but something about the stillness outside, the darkness closing in, started to feel wrong. The first odd thing happened around midnight. I was reading a book by the fire, the crackle of burning was the only sound in the room, when I heard something outside. It was faint at first, barely audible over the wind. A rustling, like someone, was moving through the underbrush near the cabin. I set my book down, straining my ears to hear. The noise stopped for a moment, then came again, a soft shuffle of feet on leaves and twigs. My heart started to pick up pace. At first, I thought it could be an animal, a deer or a boar maybe, but the sound was too deliberate, too purposeful. It wasn't the scurry of a creature running away, but rather the slow, cautious movement of someone or something approaching the cabin. I stood up, unsure of what to do. The idea of going outside to investigate seemed reckless. I wasn't equipped to deal with anything out there, and besides, I was alone. I decided to ignore it, convinced it was just my imagination or a trick of the wind. After all, the forest was full of life. But as the hours dragged on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The sounds outside grew more distinct, the occasional crack of a twig breaking, the soft rustling of leaves. It was as if someone or something was circling the cabin, trying to remain hidden but failing. I pushed the thought from my mind. I was being paranoid, I told myself. It was just the isolation getting to me, the darkness playing tricks on my mind. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The fire in the hearth had long since burned down to embers, casting only faint shadows around the room. The silence was almost suffocating now, and the coldness of the night seemed to seep deeper into my bones. I went to bed, locking the door behind me, but sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing noises outside, soft whispers on the wind, the creak of wood in the trees. Every time I closed my eyes, my mind would race, imagining someone standing just outside the window, watching me. The sounds of the forest no longer felt peaceful. They felt threatening. The next day, I decided to take a walk. The sunlight felt good on my skin, and I hoped that some fresh air would clear my mind. I grabbed my jacket and stepped out onto the porch. The cabin sat on a small hill, with a sweeping view of the forest below. The trees were starting to shed their leaves, the ground covered in a blanket of orange and brown. As I walked further into the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following me. I tried to dismiss it, but the feeling lingered, like eyes on the back of my neck. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing behind me, but each time I turned around, there was nothing, just the empty, quiet woods stretching out behind me. Around midday, I came across a small stream, its water running clear and cold over the smooth rocks. The sun was high in the sky now, and the warmth had made the air feel lighter. I sat by the water for a while, trying to shake off the unease that had been following me since last night. It helped for a moment, but as I stood to leave, I noticed something strange. A set of footprints. They were fresh, the edges of the prints still crisp in the damp soil. They weren't animal tracks. They were human. Someone had been walking in the woods, just a short distance behind me, and they had come this way. The footprints led off in the direction of the cabin. I froze. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Could have been anyone, I told myself. Maybe someone from a neighboring cabin, though I hadn't seen any signs of life nearby. Maybe it was just another hiker. But as I looked down at the tracks, I noticed something even more unsettling. The prints were too deliberate, too careful. They weren't the signs of someone lost or wandering. They were the steps of someone who knew exactly where they were going. I turned back toward the cabin, my heart pounding. I tried to convince myself that I was just being paranoid, that the forest was full of people, but the deeper I ventured into those woods, the more I felt the eyes on me. That evening, I stayed inside the cabin. The fire was low, casting long shadows on the walls. I bolted the door shut again, but I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. The wind howled outside, and every creak of the cabin seemed amplified, like it was groaning under the weight of the silence. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being hunted, and it wasn't just my imagination. Then, just before midnight, I heard it again, the rustling outside. This time, it wasn't faint. It was close. My pulse quickened. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen counter and crept to the window, peeking out through the curtains. My breath caught in my throat as I saw a figure standing just outside, too close to the cabin. I couldn't make out any details, but I could tell it was a person, standing motionless in the dark. I held my breath, hoping they hadn't seen me, but the figure didn't move. They just stood there, staring at the cabin. I knew then that I wasn't alone in the woods, but who could it be? Was it the same person whose footprints I'd found? I had no way of knowing. Whoever they were, they hadn't made a move yet. The night dragged on, the figure never leaving my sight. The cabin felt smaller, more claustrophobic. I didn't dare leave to confront the person outside. I had no idea what they wanted, and the idea of stepping out into the dark, unprotected, was terrifying. Finally, when the figure seemed to turn and walk away, I felt a surge of relief. But I didn't sleep much that night. I stayed awake, listening to every sound, every creak of the wood, terrified that they would return. The next morning, I left. I packed my things, not bothering to stay another night. I'd come here to escape, but all I'd found was fear. As I drove away, the cabin grew smaller in my rearview mirror, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. I didn't know who or what had been lurking in those woods, but I knew one thing for sure. I would never return to that cabin again. It was late October, just before the full chill of winter hit the northern edge of New York. The air was crisp, dry, and the kind of cold that gnaws at your bones. I had been working as a forester for the past 3 years, managing tree health in some of the more remote parts of the Adirondack Mountains. I was used to being alone in the woods, but something about this trip felt different. It was supposed to be just another weekend at the cabin my grandfather left me, a place I had spent a lot of time in over the years, but the atmosphere felt off. The cabin was tucked away, far enough from the main road that the isolation was complete. The nearest town, a small village called West Branch, was about a half-hour drive. The cabin itself was old. My grandfather had built it in the early 70s, and despite its age, it had held up better than most places. The wood, a dark red pine, still had that smell of fresh sap if you knew how to catch it on the wind. The windows were small, the roof slanted, and the porch was creaky. I liked it that way. It felt like home. When I arrived late that Friday afternoon, the sun was already dipping behind the mountains. I unpacked my gear quickly, set up the wood stove, and started a fire in the fireplace. It had been a long week, and the quiet of the cabin seemed like the perfect escape. My plan was simple. Stay the weekend, do a little reading, maybe take a hike in the morning to check the traps I'd set earlier in the week. Nothing too strenuous. I had brought a few books, a bottle of whiskey, and a pack of cigarettes for good measure. That night, I ate a simple dinner: spaghetti, a can of beans, and some bread I'd picked up from a local bakery. As the fire crackled, I poured myself a drink and stared at the flames, letting the warmth seep into my bones. I didn't think much about it, but the solitude felt more intense than usual, like the silence was a living thing, pressing in from all sides. Around midnight, I went outside to smoke a cigarette on the porch. The air had gotten colder, and the sky was thick with clouds. It would rain by morning, I was sure of it. The wind had picked up, rattling the branches in the trees, making everything feel a little more alive than it should. I didn't mind the wind, though. The trees around the cabin were solid, sturdy. If anything, they made me feel protected. I took a long drag, watching the smoke curl up into the night. That's when I heard it. A twig snap, distant but sharp, followed by another. I froze, listening. There was something wrong about it. The noise was too deliberate, too intentional. Someone or something was out there. I stood still for a few moments, trying to convince myself it was just an animal. Maybe a deer or a raccoon. But there was no mistaking the sound. It was a human footstep, slow, deliberate. I didn't move, not yet. The cabin was small, and the woods around it thick. The trees loomed over the cabin like silent giants, their branches reaching out, creaking in the wind. But this was different. This wasn't the usual night sounds. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I slowly put out the cigarette, my eyes scanning the dark beyond the porch. The cabin was tucked against the base of a hill, with the woods stretching out in every direction. There was nowhere for someone to hide without being noticed. I had hiked these woods for years. I thought I saw a movement in the shadows at the tree line, a figure, but I couldn't be sure. It was too dark, and the flickering light from the fire barely reached that far. The air grew heavier, and my breath came out in short bursts, visible in the cold air. I had no weapon, no rifle, no pistol. It felt strange, being out here alone without anything to protect myself. I had been through plenty of rough patches in these woods, but this felt different. I wasn't just being paranoid. Something was wrong. I didn't want to go outside. I didn't want to face whatever was out there, but I knew I couldn't stay locked inside either. Whoever or whatever was lurking outside would know I was here, and if I didn't act fast, it might have a chance to get closer. I grabbed a small flashlight from the table and slowly opened the front door. The cold hit me immediately, and I stepped out onto the porch, scanning the darkness with the light. The beam flickered over the trees, but there was no sign of movement. Then, as I stepped off the porch and into the dirt path leading to the woods, the flashlight caught something that sent a jolt of cold fear straight into my stomach. It was a set of footprints in the mud, fresh, with the edges still sharp. Whoever had been out there wasn't far off. The prints led into the trees. I felt a rush of adrenaline. I wasn't stupid. I knew what I was getting into, but I had to know. I had to see who or what was out there. I followed the tracks, my boots crunching against the leaves, the beam of the flashlight dancing over the ground. The further I went, the deeper into the woods I walked, the more the silence pressed in. The trees were tall here, so tall that they blocked out most of the sky. The air felt dense, heavy with the scent of pine and earth, the weight of it almost suffocating. I don't know how far I went before I saw it. The edge of something that shouldn't have been there. Tarp, black, ragged. It was draped over a low branch, hanging off the side of an old log. At first, I thought it was a piece of garbage, but something about it felt wrong. A sense of dread washed over me. I stepped closer, the beam of the flashlight reflecting off something shiny beneath the tarp. A trap, a snare, set up low to the ground, with a series of sharp metal teeth, glistening in the weak light. My heart raced. I backed away from it slowly, careful not to disturb anything. The last thing I wanted was to trigger some kind of mechanism. And then I heard it again, a branch snapping behind me, followed by the unmistakable sound of a footstep. I wasn't alone. I spun around, flashlight raised, but there was nothing but the dark, thick forest and the weight of my breath. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. Who was out here? Why? I didn't wait to find out. I turned and ran, back toward the cabin, my feet pounding against the earth, the flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. The night was alive with sounds now, the rustle of the leaves, the distant snap of branches, and all of it seemed to be coming from every direction at once. The darkness was closing in. I reached the cabin door in what felt like a heartbeat. I slammed it shut behind me, bolting it quickly, and leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my hands trembled. I had no idea what I had just run from, but I knew one thing: I wasn't alone. The rest of the night was spent in a feverish panic. I checked every window, bolted every door, and even set up a few makeshift traps of my own, though I knew they were no match for whatever or whoever was out there. By morning, the rain had started, washing away the footprints and the remnants of the night's terror. But the feeling, that lingering sense of dread, never left me. I spent the next few hours nervously packing up, ready to leave. I wasn't about to stick around. As I started the truck and drove away from the cabin, I looked back once, through the rearview mirror, at the trees behind me. There was nothing, no figure, no movement, just the fog of the morning rain hanging in the air. And that's when it hit me. There was no way anyone would have been able to move through those woods so quietly, so precisely. Not without practice, not without knowing every inch of the land, every tree, every shadow. It wasn't a person out there. It was something else. Something that knew this place far better than I did. Something that I had no intention of finding again. I drove straight through the rain, my hands gripping the wheel, the road stretching out in front of me. But I knew one thing for sure. I wouldn't be back. I never went back to that cabin, and I never will. It was the summer of 2015 when I decided to take a trip out into the mountains for a week of solitude. At 29, I'd spent most of my life living in the city, and work had been wearing me thin. A couple of months of endless deadlines and late nights had drained the life out of me, so I needed a break. I wanted to get away from everything, no phone, no emails, no distractions. Just peace and quiet, with the mountains as my backdrop. A friend of mine, Jeff, had a cabin he had inherited from his grandfather deep in the hills of eastern Oregon. He'd invited me there a few times, but I'd always found an excuse not to go. The cabin was old, barely maintained, and in a location so remote that even Jeff had started to talk about selling it off. I had never considered it seriously, but something about the idea of being completely isolated intrigued me. So when I mentioned needing some time away, Jeff offered me the cabin, and I didn't hesitate. I thought it would be a perfect way to disconnect and clear my mind. The drive was long, a few hours outside of Portland. The further I drove, the fewer cars I saw, and the more the landscape changed. The city's sharp lines gave way to curves and hills, eventually melting into towering trees that blocked out the sun in some places. The winding roads were narrow, with no guardrails, and it felt like I was heading deeper into the wilderness. I followed the route Jeff had given me, taking mental notes as the scenery grew more and more isolated. Eventually, I arrived. The cabin wasn't much, a simple two-story structure that looked like it could use a coat of paint and a good repair on the porch. It was nestled at the foot of a hill, surrounded by dense trees. The air was heavy with the smell of pine, damp earth, and the faint scent of decay from the woods. The cabin's roof was dark with age, the windows were a little crooked, and the wood was weathered, the kind of place that looked like it hadn't seen a visitor in years. I parked my car, grabbed my bags, and walked up to the door. It creaked as I opened it, a sound that would set the tone for the whole trip. Inside, the cabin was simple, furnished with what looked like a mix of old pieces. A worn-out couch, a rickety dining table, and a fireplace that looked like it had been used more for storage than warmth. The floor was made of rough pine, scratched and uneven, and the walls were adorned with photographs of people I didn't recognize, most likely distant relatives of Jeff's grandfather. The first few hours were peaceful. I unpacked, set up a few things, and then made my way outside to get a feel for the area. The land around the cabin was thick with trees, and there were small trails leading into the woods, but I had no intention of venturing too far that day. I was content to sit on the porch, sip on some coffee, and listen to the sounds of the forest. The breeze rustled the leaves, and every so often, a bird would call out in the distance. It was the perfect escape, or so I thought. That evening, after I cooked myself a simple dinner of canned soup and crackers, I settled in front of the fireplace with a book. It was a quiet night, the kind where the crackle of the fire was the loudest sound in the room. The darkness outside felt alive, like something was watching, but I chalked it up to the isolation. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Around 10 p.m., I heard something. It started as a soft thud, like a branch falling in the woods. I didn't think much of it at first, but then I heard it again, a dull, rhythmic thumping. I stood up, walked to the window, and peered out into the darkness, my breath fogging up the glass. I couldn't see anything, No movement, no animals, just the thick shadows of the trees. The sound stopped. I turned away from the window and tried to shake off the unease. Maybe it was an animal or perhaps just the wind. I went back to the couch and tried to distract myself with the book again. The thumping came again, louder this time, closer. It was unmistakable, something was out there. I stood still, my heart racing. It was coming from the back of the cabin, the direction of the woods. The noise sounded like footsteps, deliberate and heavy, as if someone or something was walking around the cabin. I didn't know what to think. Maybe it was a person, but who would be out here so far from any road or town? I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, maybe a bear or a deer, but deep down, I knew that wasn't right. The noise was too calculated, too human. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and stepped cautiously out onto the porch. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but it revealed nothing but trees and the distant shape of the hills. The thumping had stopped. I stood there for a moment, listening. The air felt still, unnaturally so. My eyes scanned the shadows, waiting for something to move. I expected an animal to dart out at any moment, but there was nothing, just the trees swaying in the wind. I went back inside and locked the door behind me. The feeling of being watched never left me, though, and I spent the rest of the night with the light on, the shadows outside seeming to press in closer as the hours stretched on. The next day, I decided to go for a walk. The weather was still clear, the sun peeking through the clouds, and I figured that some fresh air might clear my head. The noise from the previous night still lingered in the back of my mind, but I pushed it down. I didn't want to overreact. I was alone, yes, but that didn't mean there was something out there to fear. I followed one of the trails behind the cabin, my boots crunching on the dry leaves as I made my way deeper into the woods. The forest was dense here, with trees so close together that their branches intertwined above me, blocking out most of the sunlight. It felt different from the usual wilderness, more oppressive, like the trees were closing in on me. I came to a clearing after about an hour of walking. There, I saw it, a small structure barely more than a shed. It was old, its wood gray and cracked with age, the roof sagging and partially caved in. I hadn't seen it when I arrived the day before. It must have been further back than I thought. Curiosity got the best of me, and I walked up to the shed. It had no door, just a gaping hole in the front, and the air around it smelled sour, like rot. I peered inside, but it was empty except for some broken furniture and old, weathered tools. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. My heart beat faster, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. That's when I noticed something strange. Near the back of the shed, partially buried in the dirt, was an old wooden box. It was small, with iron hinges that had rusted over the years. The box seemed out of place, not something you'd expect to find in an abandoned shed. I bent down to get a closer look, my flashlight flickering in the dim light. The box was old, but it hadn't decayed as much as the rest of the shed. It seemed strangely well preserved. Without thinking too much about it, I reached down and tried to pull it out of the dirt. Just as my fingers brushed the box, I heard something. A sound, soft at first, but growing louder. It was a rustling sound, like something was moving through the trees. I froze, holding my breath, straining to listen. The rustling grew louder, closer. Something was out there. I quickly grabbed the box, stuffed it into my bag, and stood up, my pulse pounding in my ears. The rustling stopped abruptly. Silence. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I didn't. I didn't know why. Maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe I just needed to get back to the cabin. So, I did what felt safest. I walked back slowly, keeping my eyes on the trees, half expecting something to jump out at me. As I reached the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I locked the door behind me and set the box on the table. I stared at it for a while, wondering if I should open it. The desire to know what was inside gnawed at me, but a deeper instinct told me not to. That night, I didn't hear the footsteps again, but I couldn't sleep. The weight of the silence pressed in on me, and I lay wide awake, waiting for something, anything to happen. The cabin felt like a trap now, and I knew that I couldn't stay there much longer. The next morning, I packed up my things and left. I didn't care what was in the box anymore. I didn't care about the cabin or the woods or the strange feeling that had gripped me. I just needed to leave. As I drove back down the winding road, I could feel my heart slowing, the tension leaving my body with each mile. But even now, I wonder, what was that noise in the woods? And what was in that box? I'll never know, and I'm okay with that. Some things are better left forgotten.